consistently through all these systems, I don't know how to call it in English, to have a learning outcomes approach, and it's also relevant to have some sort of connection in the learning outcomes approach in both formal and non-formal situations and types of standards used, qualifications used.
Yeah, that's right, because that is also linked then to the competences for individual ones to acquire. So another issue which was coming quite often during this conference was the issue of the awareness building. Everybody knows about the formal system, how to get into it and things like that, but it looks to be a little bit more difficult with the validation of non-formal and informal learning. So what do we think could be the ways to address it, or to make people aware that that validation exists, and what are the benefits of that for them and the employers, naturally?
Ooh, there's a lot of promotional activities that can be done for that, of course, and I think one of the best ways is to have good practices put in the spotlights, have people have experienced it themselves, or organizations that have worked with it tell their stories, and they are better, more trustable, believable than VPL practitioners or providers or people from the government. And I also think what we need is more evidence for the success of VPL. I think we need to have more statistics on what are the follow-up of VPL procedures. How good are people doing in their work, in their career advancement? How good are people doing in their educational, and how is it compared to others? We need to have more research on really what is the value and the equivalence of all types of learning compared to the formal learning, because I really liked one quote of our Finnish colleague, Vuorinen, who said that curriculum is a tool rather than a rule, but still formal learning is overrated, and informal and non-formal learning is underrated. And I think the only way to tackle that is to have more research and more evidence.
On this last part, I couldn't agree more. We see that there's a lack of data and follow-up, and that makes it hard to promote the positive benefits of validation. Yes, I think we need to do something about this. I often get the question, but is there a real need? Do people need validation? And they say, no, we don't think so, because no one really asks for it. And I say, well, how can you ask for something that you actually don't know exists? So I think promoting the idea of validation, the possibility of validation, is really important. And right now I just have one answer: use social media, because where do else people get information today?
Yes, I agree with everything that has been said. I think it's very important to showcase good practice, but also to showcase the diversity in the good practice. So it's a very, very diverse field, and I think that needs to be highlighted. It's not as something which is just very uniform across countries and even across sectors, and I think that needs to be. And of course, research is very important. I think we should definitely do a lot of research in certain thematic issues, which are the burning issues. I think that is very important to do a couple of research in thematic areas. That's another thing, and make business cases out of that, and to see to what extent it can actually be implemented. And I think action research can be very good, because there's a lot of activity going on in VPL, and I think if you could combine this activity together with certain research elements that are coming out of it would be very interesting, of course. And of course, I think collaborating with, collaborating across international agencies is turning out to be a very important way of communicating, because a lot of us are we do not want to duplicate a lot of what we're doing. And I think now the collaboration between CIDFOP, ETF, and Unesco is taking place at the level of national qualification frameworks, and we're planning to do that also at the level of VPL. so that also international agencies should be able to see what is happening across countries, not only within. I think this comparative perspective is another way to communicate, because you learn actually by seeing what is happening in other contexts. You know, I think that way of communicating about the issue of VPL is quite effective way for communicating good practices. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with what has been said, especially I agree with the colleague from the Dutch ministry. I think awareness raising raises a lot of challenges which are different in countries with different cultures. For example, in a country as formal as Italy, it's going to be a bigger challenge than in other countries with a more works-based approach to education. So again, we will have to be careful and differentiate our approach. And I think that we always have to bear in mind two, if not more, but let's say two main, in my opinion, target of this awareness raising. And one are the individuals who can benefit from this, but the other one are the employers, because if they don't value the qualifications or the outcomes of validation, then individuals will not get the most out of this process. And also, I would like to say that guidance will play the biggest role in directing people to the right choice. And it might be validation, it might not be validation. So this is also, I agree very much with an idea of some kind of skill centers, which will help the understanding what the individual needs, and to directing them to either validation or further learning or apprenticeship or whichever would be the best solution to reach his or her goals.
Well, how to promote VPL? For several years we've been also talking about how to increase participation, how to get more adults into learning, and then we said use the learner, use the learning champion. Maybe we could also use the learner and use those who have been through the validation process to spread the word, to talk about the positive experiences of having their learning outcomes accredited. In Norway, the Norwegian Ministry of Education just recently carried out a research on non-formal learning, the satisfaction with the learning outcomes, and 92% of those who attend the courses, they were very happy with the learning outcomes. They classified them in 4 different groups, and the most important was the motivation to learn more. And in order to use the learner again for promoting VPL, we have to take maybe one step back and take seriously and do something serious about accreditation and recognition and making visible the learning outcomes of non-formal learning. And then if we do that, then we can use the learner to promote that.
There's so many directions I could go with this, but I think that one of the concerns worldwide has been relatively low uptakes of VPL processes. But I think if we look at the history in countries where it's been in effect for longer, France, the United States, what we see actually is an encouraging growth. I mean, we saw the figures from France today, and it does increase. There is a spread by word of mouth from learner to learner. But I also think it's important for us to actually draw on marketing professionals who are very good at giving a direction on how to promote, how to get the word out on topics they know nothing about, but they do know the channels to reach people. We have used a marketing company at my university. We did some research, got them to do some research at universities around North America, and we have discovered that if universities promote the availability of PLAR, then students will be more likely to choose that university. So it's become very important information for us. I'd also like to stress that although I'm all in favor of doing more research, there actually has been a lot of research done, and part of my surprise is how little people seem to know about what that research is and what it says. So I'd really encourage you to, familiarize yourself with information that can be really powerful tools in terms of the benefits of RPL. There are stats, there are follow-up studies, there's information that you can use to convince the skeptics, possibly employers, I don't know, university administrators, whatever, that it does work. So use what we've got. Keep on getting better information, but don't dismiss what's being done so far.
Actually, in Korea, I'm working at the government affiliation. So the bottom line is who gets the money from the government. That is the key. So in that sense, in order to promote the practice of VPL, I need to get the funding from the government. So then, in order to persuade the people in the accounting or financial stuff in the government, we need proof that it has a benefit for individual learners, for the employers. So as ladies from next to me said, also I met Judy Harris finally because I read her books, 2 books already, and then, so there is a bunch of evidence already in the place. And then the thing is, I need proof, Korean based proof that the VPL might be benefit to the other learners, employers, and then other stakeholders. The sad thing is, if the VPL gets some money, or also they can create the money, then higher ed, they all gonna be involved in this VPL business. So that is a sad thing. But anyway, so I need the proof to persuade the government officials that VPL might bring the benefit to the other learners and higher ed and other stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. This is all food for thought, but also food for bodies waiting outside. So I just have the last short question, and that is something which our Korean colleague said about, that is the funding, the money. Do you think that the funding for the VPL should have a similar status or a similar role that the money which countries provide for the formal education? The financing in general.
I'm going to imitate my Korean colleague.
Well, it's up to the countries to, of course, decide how they will finance the system, but the funding can be the way of creating fragmentation. So it's important to think how to use funding in order not to do it.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer either. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, in France, the budget for validation comes from the budget for education. This was what our French colleagues were telling us in the European Qualification Framework Advisory Group, and they thought that this was one of the key success factors, because this would enable you the flexibility to use the funding, and it also, as a conceptual message, it was effective. I can tell you that there are European fundings available for certain countries and certain situations that the European Social Fund can be used. And under some other initiatives like the Youth Guarantee schemes that encourages countries also to implement the recommendation and validation, it would be possible to get some kind of fundings, but this would of course fall into the category risk of fragmentation, because it would be only for certain projects.
In the countries that we've been working on, I think there is this tendency to mainstream VPL, either in the context of non-formal education system or in the context of national qualification framework. So that's a very encouraging thing, you know. So in a lot of countries, the national qualification authorities are actually steering the process of VPL. So it's mainstreamed into the education. So I think funds are available in that context. In any case, VPL should not be, it should be low in costs. It should not be a cumbersome process. It should be a simplified process. One shouldn't have very, take the example of Japan. They have a job card system, which is part of the enterprise thing. And I think these things are developing in a lot of countries. You don't really need to have a complicated system. But I think a lot of countries are very, very pragmatic about the whole thing, and I think the cost issue would be a barrier to accessibility for the groups who really need to benefit, who really need to access education. So there needs to be, and then this whole issue about also setting up assessment centers and all. This is very cost heavy, so one has to take that into account. But I do think at the moment what one sees that RPL is very much a sectoral issue. So you're either, if it's happening in the workplace context, it's the social partners that are funding that, and if it's happening at the higher education sector, it's the Ministry of Education. So it's still a very, very sectoral issue.
Yep, now we're down to the nitty-gritty. Who's going to pay? And this is, I think, one of the hardest questions, but I also think that this is one of the reasons that we see fragmentation, because funding comes from different channels, and funding is not thought through on a strategic level. And I think that and how to do it, I have no good answer for, but I think we need to start moving from this project-funded base, where you have the possibility to put people through a validation process, and then the project ends and the possibility goes away. So we need to start thinking about building sustainable financing models. And then, like Antra said, I think those models need, of course, to be within the national contexts. But I do believe that it's important to start moving away from the project-based approach, the project funding, to